Thanks everyone for joining us for the Community IT Innovators webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about the best of nonprofit tech, the NTC 2013. And the presenters we have are CTO Matthew Eshleman and COO Johan Hammerstrom. Just a few tips before we get started. We encourage you to ask questions within GoToWebinar. We'll also be sharing a few polls, so we invite you to interact with us. And if possible, avoid multitasking. Finally, we always get asked if we are going to be sharing the PowerPoint and recording afterwards. So just to let you know, we will be sending out those links after the webinar. Just a little bit about Community IT. We work with nonprofits in the DC metro area, and we help them to address their strategic and day-to-day IT challenges. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenters for today, Matthew Eshleman, who is the Chief Technology Officer, and Johan Hammerstrom, who is the Chief Operating Officer.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Really happy to have you here. Thank you, Roshni, for that introduction. My name is Johan Hammerstrom. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Community IT Innovators, and you can see my information up there on the screen. And we're just happy to have everybody here and look forward to this opportunity to talk a little bit about the end-to-end Nonprofit Technology Conference. So before we begin, we just want to do a quick poll, find out how many people in the audience there are attended the Nonprofit Technology Conference this year. Great. Most of you have not. Great. Well, we hope this is an opportunity for us to kind of fill you in on what happened in Minneapolis, and definitely look forward to sharing our experiences with you and answering any questions that you might have. If you're on Twitter, one way to get some great information about the Nonprofit Technology Conference is to just use this hashtag here, #13NTC, and it's still getting, I don't know, 30 or 40 tweets a day, as far as I can tell, of people who are following up on things that they learned or were excited about or inspired by the Nonprofit Technology Conference. So just to start off with, the Nonprofit Technology Conference is really the only conference of its kind, in our experience, that brings together staff and consultants and others who are interested in how technology is being used in the nonprofit sector. It's been going on for over 10 years now. It grew out of the circuit rider movement in the late 90s and early 2000s, and every year attracts more and more attendees. And I think there are about 2,500 folks who attended the Nonprofit Technology Conference in Minneapolis this year. The next conference is going to be in Washington, D.C. next year. So if you're local and attending this webinar today, definitely get that on your radar, the 14 NTC, and keep that in mind for next year. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I don't know where they got this picture of beautiful, sunny Minneapolis, but that certainly wasn't our experience. The weather in Minneapolis was kind of dreary. So, you know, as we were landing on the plane, we saw that there was snow out there, and we walked over to the hotel, and you know, they were plowing the snow. So it's definitely still winter up there, but we had a really good time in Minneapolis. It's a really interesting city. For us who came from DC, you know, I'm not personally used to those big, tall buildings, so that's always exciting to see. And honestly, we spent a good part of the day at the conference itself and didn't get out too much. So the agenda for the webinar today, what are we going to cover? We just wanted to, you know, provide you with an overview of the Nonprofit Technology Conference. And typically it's a 3-day conference. The first day involves a welcome session and then move straight into the breakout sessions. And the breakout sessions are basically smaller presentations where the attendance varies from anywhere from a dozen people attending a session to up to 100 people attending a session. And those breakouts are organized along the lines of different tracks. So there's an IT staff track, a leadership track, a fundraising track, and so you can really, based on those tracks, identify the types of topics and sessions that you're interested in attending. So the first day usually involves 1 or 2 breakout sessions, and then a science fair, which is essentially a vendor hall, which we'll talk about towards the end. The second day of the End-to-End Conference, Nonprofit Technology Conference, involves a keynote speech, and we're going to spend some time talking about this year's keynote, followed by 3 breakout sessions. And during any breakout session time, there's up to 24 different sessions going on. So there's a lot of information, a lot of knowledge sharing at the End-to-End Conference, a lot more than any one person on their own can digest. And Matt and I both went this year, and we're just going to basically do our best to share our impressions of what we learned. On the third and final day of the conference, in the morning there's always a panel discussion, and this year it was on little bets. We're going to talk about that. And then finally, Matt and I are going to share just briefly the sessions that we gave at the End-to-End Conference. Matt gave a session on IT governance, and I gave a session on the future of IT. And then finally, if we have time, we'll just talk about some interesting takeaways. Anything else? Anything you wanted to add, Matt, before we move on?
No, I mean, I think that's a great overview, and hopefully, since the majority of the attendees on the webinar weren't actually at the session, we can communicate kind of the sense of community that End-to-End has created over the years, and I think has done a very good job of continuing. So, yeah, I think it's a good agenda for us today.
Great, great, and please use the GoToWebinar software to ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them during the session. So, without further ado, so this year's keynote, I really enjoyed a lot. I found it very provocative, very interesting. It was by a man named Dan Pelota. Some of you may have heard of him before. He founded and ran the AIDS Ride back in the early 2000s. That ended up being kind of a controversial organization, and he ended up leaving sort of under a cloud of controversy. He went on to form a couple of different nonprofits, mostly fundraising nonprofits, since then, and last year released a book called Uncharitable. And the book was really kind of the culmination of over 2 decades of his experience in the nonprofit sector, and kind of his frustration with what he felt like was a lack of effectiveness on the part of the nonprofit sector in accomplishing its missions. And so, thanks, Roshni, I'm sorry. So he gave a talk at the End-to-End this year that was really based, a longer version of his TED Talk. He gave a talk at the recent TED conference, a TEDx talk, and it was one of the most well-regarded talks at that conference. So you can answer the poll that we just launched. Just curious how many of you have heard his TED Talk. I'll give a minute or two for the people to respond. While you're responding, I did want to mention that traditionally the speaker at the End-to-End Conference, while very interesting, is sometimes only sort of peripherally connected to the nonprofit sector. So probably the best example for me was back in 2006 in Seattle. Guy Kawasaki, who's he was the Mac evangelist, I think was his title back in the 80s and 90s. Now he's sort of a professional speaker. He's an interesting guy. He actually just started a gig with Motorola. He's published a book on how to publish your own book called Ape. And anyways, he's a really interesting guy. He's kind of at the forefront of digital thought. And it was basically a presentation on how to make good presentations. And it remains one of the best presentations I've ever seen. But it was not that closely related to the nonprofit sector, and he kind of at the end sort of fumbled a, well, you're doing great work and you need good presentations to share that with other people, and thanks, thanks Cleveland, I'll see you all later, was kind of how it ended. So this year I think was really, I really appreciated the fact that NTEN got a speaker who was speaking directly to issues that affect the nonprofit sector. So looking at the poll, only a handful of people have seen Dan Pelota's TED Talk. So I would strongly encourage you all, if you have time, it's about 20 minutes long, to watch it. It's very provocative, very interesting, and I think he's really, sparking a conversation that is a lot of people are getting engaged with in the nonprofit sector. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I think it's a great overview in terms of setting the stage, and I think the amount of ongoing conversation related to Dan's talk was certainly something that was a topic of much conversation that day, and then in the following days came up in a number of sessions that I attended with some with the concepts that he was bringing up. So I think it's a very it was a great speaker to have in terms of getting a conversation going, creating some controversy as well. Yeah, exactly. And so I think in general, most of the people that I spoke with after the fact, sort of agreed that, maybe they disagreed with him as a messenger or with some of the points he was making, but they felt like he was really, starting a conversation that needed to have. So what did Dan talk about in his keynote? So first of all, he basically made 5 points. And the first was this, that nonprofits are operate at a disadvantage because they've essentially assumed that they have to pay less than other sectors. And that certainly, in our experience, extends throughout the nonprofit organization, regardless of what position you're in. But he mostly, in his presentation, highlighted on positions of leadership. So, people who are in leadership positions, tend to make significantly less than their peers in the for-profit sector or even in the non-social mission nonprofit sector. So some of the examples he used were, he basically pulled up the salaries of the chief executive officers of major health nonprofit organizations like the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, I believe, and all those salaries were averaging around $500,000. And he said that these organizations are constantly under fire for the amount of money that their CEOs are paid. Then he went and he pulled up a slide showing the compensation of your average health insurance CEO, and of course it was about 30 times larger. It was, I think the average was something like $10 million a year. And he said the point he was making was, why is the work that someone who's trying to stop cancer, trying to raise money and fund research to stop heart disease, why are they paid so much less than someone who's running a health insurance organization? And he went into more detail. There's a lot more to it than what I just said, but that was kind of his fundamental point. And that basically, by paying significantly less, the nonprofit sector is sort of devaluing the work that it does, and it makes it harder to attract and retain people to do that work. Second, the nonprofits are... Yeah, I mean, I think that I just wanted to follow up, Johan, on some of the ramifications of the low compensation. I think one of his additional points was related to the ability to attract and retain top talent that can really make an impact, and essentially was kind of making the case that because nonprofits are paying less, they're not able to attract that type of leadership that may be able to have a good impact. And so whenever it comes to a choice between paying $400,000 to somebody who could transform an organization versus $100,000 to somebody who can just kind of keep it going, often the decision is to pay less because, well, that's all we can afford, and the mindset is really on not spending a lot versus trying to create a lot of impact. And I think that's the shift in the conversation in terms of as opposed to focusing on cost first, trying to shift the conversation to focusing on impact first.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And he sort of extended that into the realm of advertising and marketing, and that nonprofits are basically expected to spend as little as possible on their advertising and marketing campaigns, and yet they're expected to have these incredible results. And he drew another contrast with the for-profit sector, where spending a large amounts of money on splashy marketing campaigns and product launches and so forth is not, in fact, it's encouraged. It's seen as kind of the only way or the best way to get your message out. And he was just asking a question like, why is it the exact opposite mentality when it comes to the nonprofit sector? And I think more broadly, like part of a lot of the examples he was using and the point he was making was, why do nonprofits feel like a lot of the operational and management and strategic efforts that for-profits have found to be successful, why can't nonprofits make use of those as well to try to be more effective in the work that they're doing? And in a similar way, the idea of taking risk on new revenue ideas. So, and this kind of tied into the panel discussion on the second day. There is, I think, a strong incentive by funders who fund nonprofits to stick with proven solutions, the tried and true. Like you need to stick with programs that are proven to deliver a certain type of outcome, whereas oftentimes solving problems, whether those problems are delivering a new service or solving a larger problem than that, oftentimes solving problems involves taking risks on new ideas that aren't necessarily going to work, and being open to spending money on things that might fail the first time around, but will eventually allow you to learn what works and what doesn't work, and therefore become more effective in the long run. This is that concept is sort of well accepted in the for-profit sector, but is something that is very difficult to, something that just is kind of a sacred cow in the nonprofit sector. He talked about time, and in that he was talking about sort of time to results. So, one of the things that I talked about in my session on the future of IT was that developing the iPhone took 3 years. That Apple started the process in 2004. The iPhone launch didn't happen until 2007, and there was this long-term 3-year investment on this new product. And I'm always reluctant to use any Apple examples, because I think you don't want to just assume that well, if we just did it the way Apple did it, we'd be just as successful as Apple. But it's a good illustration of the fact that sometimes when you're trying to do something radically new or different, such as solving incredible and intractable social problems, it sometimes takes a long time to get traction on those, and that oftentimes the funding cycle that nonprofits have to operate in is a 6-month or 1-year funding cycle, and funders are often reluctant to give them 4 or 5 years to make headway on a problem. They want to see results right away. And I think his point there also was, some of the problems that we're trying to solve, and some of the examples he used were hunger, poverty, suicide, cancer, AIDS. These problems are actually much more difficult to solve than building a better smartphone, and yet, in every way, nonprofits are forced to work with much smaller resources to try to get it done faster. They're just being held to different standards that we would never think to hold a for-profit company to. And profit, to attract risk capital, the point that he was making there is, why can't nonprofits actually make a profit as a way of attracting investment and use a profit motive to help solve some of these problems? One other point, these are the 5 main points of his presentation, but one other point that he made, and what kind of tied all of this together, was basically this concept of the low overhead culture. And he brought forward a lot of examples, and I think any of us who worked in the nonprofit sector for a long time know that this mantra of keep your overhead low is sort of the dominant one within nonprofits. And in some cases, it's seen as the most important metric for measuring the success of a nonprofit, the most important metric that funders or individual donors should be looking at before they make a decision about which nonprofit they want to work with. And he felt like this low overhead culture creates all kinds of problems and leads to a lot of the problems that I mentioned on the previous slide. So some of the three big points that Dan Pelota made with it. One, it sort of reinforces this idea that overhead is not part of the cause, that somehow you can raise a lot of money or serve a lot of people without actually being organized around doing that, or having staff that help you do that. And he felt like one of the main things that nonprofits and charities, was the term that he used, need to focus on now is kind of dismantling this whole narrative around the low overhead culture, and that low overhead nonprofits are the most successful nonprofits. And so it creates this misconception that overhead is kind of irrelevant or wasteful. It creates the misconception, and it also forces charities to not invest in the things that they need to grow effectively, and instead focus on keeping overhead low. And his question was, the question he asked was like, in taking that approach, how much money is the organization losing for the cause by not investing enough? And so he had a great graphic, which basically the example was, let's say we have a nonprofit that's raising money for AIDS research, and it only invests 10% of its total budget in overhead, and it's raising 90%. And then you have another nonprofit that invests 40% of its budget in overhead. Well, clearly the one that's investing 10% is doing better, if you assume that they're both raising the same amount of money. But if that 40% that's invested allows them to raise $18 million, whereas the nonprofit that's only investing 10% raises only $100,000, who's actually contributing more to the cause? And he has a great graphic that does a lot more justice to that argument than my explanation just did. So if you're interested in this, or whether you are or not, I think this is going to become a conversation that is more and more common in the nonprofit sector, and I'd encourage you to, watch his TED Talk on it.
Yeah, I think the other thing that he did in terms of making the point of this idea that overhead is bad is that there's a number of certification or credentialing institutions that have kind of sprung up, Charity Navigator, Better Business Bureau, among others, that put their seal of approval on this organization is a good organization because they have a relatively low overhead, and his point was that looking at low overhead as a successful metric of an organization isn't necessarily the complete picture. His own experience in terms of starting the AIDS ride, he started the breast cancer walks, but I think the organizations that he had started and ran contributed, it was like $180 million towards those causes, after his expenses. But I think, the real critique of the AIDS ride was that, the overhead of those events was over 40%, and I think that's what ultimately got him in trouble. And his point was, well, the next year after a different organization did the AIDS ride, the amount of revenue that they actually generated was a tenth of what his organization had been able to do. And so I think, while he may not be the best messenger and the best case study for it, the points that he makes I think are certainly value in terms of looking at the results. And while we certainly I think can take some of the lessons learned from this the capitalistic society that we work in, those metrics for measuring success are very well defined in the for-profit world. In the nonprofit world, they're not as well as well defined in terms of what makes a successful organization.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think then the question becomes, okay, what are the next steps? I think his next steps are he's starting a charity defense fund, and he's trying to build sort of an advocacy organization that will promote some of these ideas. I think if you're going to get rid of the overhead, minimizing overhead as the dominant metric for measuring success, which I think makes a lot of sense, what do you replace it with? What becomes the new metric that's easier to understand? And I think that's an area where more work is needed. I mean, he didn't really speak to that at the conference. Anyways, it's a interesting dialogue, interesting conversation, and it's one that I'm certainly going to follow closely, and I'm really curious to see where it goes. So that was the keynote speech. And then the next day, sort of in the same vein, there was a panel discussion, and it was really inspired by this book, Little Bets, by Peter Sims. And so the panel discussion has a moderator. It typically has one or two people, one or two speakers or panelists who work at nonprofit organizations, a panelist from a funder, and a sort of an independent thinker panelist. And so that was the composition of this year's panel discussion. And the topic, I guess, that they were talking about was, again, similar to what we've been discussing already, the extent to which nonprofits are unable to sort of innovate and come up with new ideas for solving the problems they're working on because they're not allowed to fail, because they're required to constantly show progress and success in the work that they do. And so it was, again, like the way that these conversations usually go is that the independent thinker says, you need, this is a great idea, you need to do, embrace failure and learn from failure. And then the nonprofits will say, well, we want to do that, but the funders won't let us. And then the funder who's representing foundations will say, well, yes, this is something we'd like to do. So let's plan to work together to do more of this.
Yeah, I think there was, I guess, one good example that was shared from one of the panelists that ran a nonprofit and actually was able to go to their funder and say, hey, we have been kind of going on in our mission. We have some new ideas for how we think we can improve our capacity and increase our impact, but we need to try a number of different things, and they're not all going to work. So we know that we're going to have some failure, but we need to do this so that we can learn, so that we can transform our, the way that we deliver service. And in that case, delivering that framework, they were able to have the conversation with the funder to try to look beyond that initial, potential for failure to look towards the future opportunity for success. And I think that was one great case to hear, but it would have been very good, I think, to have some more specifics around what are some ways that we can kind of frame this discussion, what are some ways that we can have those conversations with these foundations that are funding it. And I think this is a topic that's had some evolution over time, and I think we are starting to see more willingness to for funders to take this approach. And then I think we're also seeing more social mission organizations or social venture funds that are going to take this approach to solving some difficult challenges apart from kind of the historical way that it's been approached.
Yeah, I think there was definitely, when that example came up, the funder who was representing the Case Foundation said, "Oh, that sounds like a great approach. I wish more of our, more of our grantees would come to us and with that kind of request." And that's the kind of dialogue we really like to have and hear more about. So, I do think there was a general sense of, this is something that could gain traction. And there was some indication that the dialogue would continue online after the conference. So I think if you just Google Little Bets NTC, it'll take you to any dialogues that might be happening. I think the hashtag was Little Bets, as far as I can remember on Twitter. So if this is something that sounds interesting to you, or you feel like your organization, has an idea that's a little bit out there, might not work, but would be, could be very fruitful in the long run, I definitely encourage you to follow up on that. And if you want us to get you the names of any of the people that were on the panel, we'd be more than happy to do that. So in addition to the keynote and the panel, there were hundreds, literally, of these breakout sessions. We wanted to talk briefly about the breakout sessions that we led, and then also talk a little bit about some of our favorite breakout sessions and some of the take-home messages we got from them. So Matt, he got to lead us off on Friday with a very exciting session on IT governance. So Matt, you want to tell us a little bit more about
that? Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I must admit, when I submitted this session, this was probably the one that I was that I was least excited about, but it was the one that got picked. But in preparing for it, and actually at the session itself, IT governance, it's not really a hot topic or something that seems very dramatic or exciting. But I thought the session went very well, and the conversation that it engendered was very helpful. So at the bottom, there's a hashtag. If you follow that, you'll get the links to the presentation that I had and some of the ongoing conversation. But I mean, fundamentally, the takeaways from the session on IT governance was around aligning technology with mission and recognizing that there is a difference between good IT governance and good IT management, and that while perhaps your day-to-day IT management may be working well, the computers are turning on, email works, if you aren't able to have a discussion about fundamentally where is the organization going and how can we use technology effectively, to that end, you're not going to be as successful as you could be. I think the other concept that we tried to highlight was around IT as an enabler throughout the organization. I think with the shift of IT being, something that was kind of tightly controlled by the IT department, it was in your server room down the hall, to the consumerization of IT, the role that IT plays needs to evolve so that, your IT person, your IT vendor needs to be able to work with and partner with the various departments, the various staff to find, what tools are they using already, and how to make them work together effectively. I had a graphic that I shared in terms of, we've gone from everything being in the server down the hall to now data being spread across multiple systems, some of which are connected, some of which are not, and the real challenge I think for IT now is to really make those platforms work together and to enable the organization to use those tools effectively. And as a result, these top-down IT edicts are gone. IT being able to kind of enforce a rigid technology platform, it's just not effective anymore. And so, a lot of the IT governance, technology, that discussion and that engagement needs to be a part of those top-level discussions. And I was really encouraged to see that there were a lot more folks in the audience that had an IT, had CIO in their title, and so they were able to, have that top-level engagement and be part of that executive-level discussion, much more so than in previous years. And then finally, have that conversation that, the conversation with other, executives or other departments really needs to be focused on, what are the organizational requirements, what are those business drivers, as opposed to, what are the specific technology systems that we're going to use. And so if you can make that shift to helping, your executive director or perhaps your board understand the reality of your current environment or the reality of your future environment, that can be a much better way to approach it. So, like I said, I think the conversation that we had was really good, and I was really encouraged to hear some of the lessons learned and some of the sharing that people had in terms of how they were able to interact with their board or their board's technology committee to make sure that the technology decisions were involving IT, and IT was available to kind of be a connector. So I was, like I said, I wasn't very excited at first, but the conversation and I think the takeaways were really valuable to me.
Yeah, I think that session went really well, and I've definitely seen some feedback on Twitter and blogs and other places that the folks who attended it really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. And it was so successful, we might be doing a webinar using that topic down the road this year, so stay tuned for that. The session I did was kind of the opposite. You know, it was one that I was probably the most excited about doing, but also a little bit apprehensive, the future of IT, just because it was kind of like, so the session title was The Future of IT, Where Is This All Going? And it was one of those things when I suggested it, I thought, well, that sounds like a cool title, and that, you know, that would be a fun session to go to. And then when it was picked, I was like, you know, I have to actually present on that. But it was great. It really helped. It gave me time and space to kind of think a little bit more about where IT is going. Because right now I feel like, you know, the world, I've been doing this for about 15 years, and we're living through right now a change that is more dramatic than any other I've experienced. The pace and degree to which IT is changing is really remarkable, and the extent to which it's affecting organizations is also really remarkable. And it's exciting. You know, it's also, it can be a little bit daunting and a little confusing. And what I really wanted to do in this session was to try to understand some of the deeper trends and, you know, the deeper context for what's going on right now, and then work backwards from there. Not to say this is the IT solution of the future, or this is, you know, what's going to happen 2 or 3 years from now, but rather to say this is the direction we're headed, and these are the kinds of things you should be looking out for. So the main focus of the session was really on sort of the advent of consumer-driven IT and the extent to which consumer-driven IT has really changed IT in every segment of technology, in every sector. And consumer-driven IT is basically, you know, when people think of that, they probably think of the iPhone, the iPad. You know, those are devices that were targeted at the consumer, and at the same time, it really revolutionized how people use technology and how technology works. So that's kind of on the device side. On the cloud side, so to speak, on the hosted service side, you know, Google Apps is one. You know, we all, not all of us, but a lot of people now use Gmail. And it's just, when that first came out, it was a very different way of using email than what people have traditionally been using. And so a lot of these advancements in development within the world of consumer-driven IT have now sort of leaked over onto the enterprise side. And I think, you know, there's no greater example of that than the person who shows up with the iPad at their office and says, okay, I've got my iPad, I'm ready to use it, you know, and the IT department comes standing around looking at each other like, what? You know, what are we supposed to do now? And actually, that's literally what happened at Dell Software, which is a part of, you know, Dell, it's a subsidiary of Dell. Basically, the CIO was, you know, one day all these people started showing up with iPads and asking, hey, how can we use these on the network? And the CIO of Dell Software was like, well, I don't know. I need to think about this. I'm totally unprepared for it. And that's one of the examples that I used in the session was, you know, what Dell Software ended up doing as far as the BYOD policy goes. So, you know, I got into a lot more detail during the session about sort of why consumer-driven IT is now becoming so important. What are some of the features of it that make it so attractive? What are some of the requirements that the enterprise has around its IT systems? And how can these two things really be harmonized? You know, how can some of the great advances that have been made on the consumer side be brought into the enterprise? And then I went through a number of examples of companies that I think are really doing really interesting work in that area. Some of the examples I used were Autodesk, who makes the AutoCAD software. It talks about Google Apps. It talks about Ignite, Dropbox, Box, and Evernote were the examples that I discussed. So if that topic sounds interesting to you, it was actually live streamed and recorded, and it's available online, and we have the link up on our website. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, you can always watch the live stream of this session online. I'm also using it as an opportunity to do sort of a mini blog series or a blog mini series, if you will, on this topic, the future of IT. And that's the first two parts are live on our website right now, and you can go there and find them. And I'll probably be publishing another 7 or 8 blog entries in that series over the next few weeks. And part of the reason for putting it in a blog is that sometimes people, some people just learn better reading than they do listening to a presentation. Other times, and there are also a lot of source materials that I used in putting that presentation together. Other people's, thoughts on this topic, a lot of interviews with, major CIOs in the world of IT, and so I've pasted links to those interviews and blog articles, and we'll be pasting more as the blog series continues. So, if that's interesting to you, please check it out. And also, if you read it and you have some ideas, or you disagree, or you have links to other cool things that are happening in the world of IT, please paste those in the comments section of the blog, or let me know on my Twitter account. I'd love to hear more about that. In fact, one of the things that I'm hoping to do, and there were a couple people who came up to me after the session in Minneapolis and shared some examples of really amazing things they're doing with Box or with Dropbox in their organization. They're bringing this consumer-driven IT solutions into their organization, and they're using it to accomplish the organization's mission. And so I'm hoping to get some guest writers to also contribute to that series, because some of the stuff that I heard about was really cool, and I just wanted to kind of share that with others as well. So that was the session that I gave. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other sessions that we went to. One of the great things about N10 is just the sheer number of sessions available. Like I said before, there's up to 2 dozen in every time slot. There are a total of, I think, eight session slots over the course of the conference. So just hundreds of sessions on all kinds of different topics and some really amazing speakers. So Matt and I both had a chance to go see some cool sessions. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about the project management tools session you went to?
Yeah, I went to a session on PM tools led by Peter Campbell, who I think did a great job of kind of facilitating a good discussion amongst IT director types and website development types, and kind of talking about the two prominent project management techniques that are happening today. Your traditional waterfall method, which is we know we need to build a bridge. How are we going to get there? Microsoft Project is kind of the example of that, and a method called Agile, which is finding a lot of favor in web development, which starts not necessarily with the end goal in mind, but focuses instead on prioritizing features or tasks, and then working quickly to build that feature, and then identify the next priority, build that, and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of kind of lessons learned and a lot of information shared about that. So my takeaways from that were actually looking at some of our workflow and finding some tools to better manage that. And so actually, as an outcome of that, we've started to test a PM tool called Trello, which is a Kanban board, which is another term that I learned at the session, as a way to just kind of track different bugs and features for our own internal systems that we manage and maintain. It seems to work much better, be a lot more fluid than some of the other tools that we had in place. So it's Trello. I'll send out the link. There's just a lot of different options that are out there, and I think one of the the things that I certainly appreciate about the N10 conference is just getting a chance to get away from the day-to-day and to think about work in a different mindset. And so the PM tools, is great. It was a problem I knew that I was searching for an answer for, but that session really helped, provide some context and some tools to help solve that.
So I went to a session on VDI, which for those of you who don't know the acronym is Virtual Desktop Infrastructure. Also starting to be known as DAS, which is Desktop as a Service. And virtual desktop infrastructure is actually kind of a catch-all term that refers to a couple of different technologies. But the basic concept is that instead of your desktop being hosted and run from a local workstation or laptop machine, it is run from a data center. And so the kind of like a terminal server for those of you who are familiar with it. But unlike a terminal server, which is a shared resource, virtual desktops do remain sort of individual. So you can do a lot of things. You can customize your desktop in a lot of ways, and you can manage it in a more central way than you can with a traditional desktop. You can manage it in a more central way than you can with a traditional desktop. You can customize it in a lot of ways more than you can with the traditional terminal server. So this is a presentation by Tech Impact, which is the rebranded Empower Pennsylvania. And they've really focused on building out a virtual desktop infrastructure service for nonprofits. And that's something that we're looking into more closely. It was more of a technical presentation. Most of the people in the audience were CIOs or IT directors from nonprofits. But it was interesting to hear about that. I think that's something that the technology is definitely there now. And the reason that we haven't seen more of that as a service from large firms like Amazon and Rackspace is that the Microsoft licensing is pretty crazy and more or less makes it not affordable to provide as a hosted service. So we'll see where that goes, if that's something that Microsoft themselves take on. But there's certainly a lot of advantages to having your desktop served to you from the cloud, and that's something that if the licensing issues could get worked out, we may see a lot more of in the next year or two. Matt, you want to talk about the data visualization?
Yeah, so I actually, as the our CTO, I don't really deal with a lot of web infrastructure at all, but I went to a session that was led by Kurt Vogler from Forum 1 Communications on data visualization, and that was probably the most technical conversation or presentation that I went to. And I think the fundamental takeaways from the data visualization session were around how to use information and pictures to effectively tell your story. And so Kurt shared a number of examples where various clients of theirs had distilled down their 100-page report into a one-page graphic or incorporated that onto their website as a way of making all this kind of big data, so to speak, easily available and easily interpretable through graphs and charts and visualization. So they really actually talked quite a bit about the technical underpinnings of a lot of their solution. So it was interesting to learn about, although not directly relevant to kind of my day-to-day work. But I think for what it did for me was to spark some ideas about, well, what information may be helpful for us to make available, and how can we communicate what we do in terms of pictures and graphs as opposed to text and reports. So again, I think this collaboration and learning from people in different sectors was a really important takeaway for me as a way to improve the way that we communicate information for our organizations and our clients.
And then one of my favorite sessions was a session on changing habits by Lila Piget, I think. I might be mispronouncing her last name. Anyway, it was also live streamed, so if you're interested in watching that, we can provide the link to it. But basically, she's a consultant with Idealist, which is a consultancy out in Portland, Oregon. And she's done a lot of work on understanding why people have certain habits when it comes to using technology, and then had some great tips on how to, kind of break those habits and form new habits around technology change. And all the examples she used were basically from the world of, a new database gets installed, a new application gets deployed at the organization, and people don't use it. They continue to use whatever Excel-based or paper-based manual entry and data processing techniques that they've always used. And I think that's a common frustration for most people in the world of technology, like, how do I get my staff to use this new system, which is going to be awesome and automate everything and collect all the data for us, and it's going to be so much more efficient. For us, it just seems so obvious. And the point that she was making was, as obvious as it might seem, these habits that form are, to some degree, beyond our conscious control. They're things that are just kind of, they become a natural part of our lives, and they're actual techniques that you can use to change those habits. And she talked through a lot of those techniques and used some great examples. So it was great. I went up to her afterwards and I was like, "Do you consult? Because I have some clients who could use your help." She's like, "Oh, no, I'm not an independent. I don't do that." But, I was really impressed by it. And if you're interested in it, we'll definitely include a link to that live stream. And she also, a lot of it was based on a book that she had read about changing habits, and she references that in her session. And then finally, Matt and I both were struck by the extent to which people aren't really talking about the cloud anymore. The cloud was a pretty big topic 2 years ago. People were still talking about it last year. No one's really talking about it anymore. Everyone's just using it. And I think that's a trend that we'll continue to see moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. I think in years past, the discussion was really about, should we go Google Apps or should we go Office 365, or what are the security concerns that we need to be aware of? How can I make sure that my data is safe? But I think those discussions have largely evolved, and while there were certainly a few holdouts of saying, well, I've got my Exchange server and it's in my office and I haven't had an outage in 8 years, the discussion I think has moved on to not when we're moving to the cloud, or not if we're moving to the cloud, but when. And I do think for most of the participants, Office 365 is basically the answer because of Microsoft's recent moves to make the E1 platform free for qualifying nonprofits. So I think that that switch has really changed the discussion or the thought in a lot of nonprofits' minds to say, hey, we're gonna make the move to Office 365, preserve the Outlook that everybody likes, and improve our uptime and availability. So I think that discussion has moved. And I think it was interesting that Google actually was kind of noticeable by its absence at NTEN this year. In the past they've led a couple of sessions, but I didn't actually see them at all this time.
Yeah, that was definitely striking. Real quick, we have about 4 minutes left, so some other takeaways. One of the great things about NTEN is just, it's a great opportunity to connect with colleagues and coworkers and former coworkers. Matt and I ran into a number of former community IT staff there, got to connect with them, and it's just a great community, really, and there's a great sort of community feel and spirit to the conference that is a lot less impersonal than other conferences that we've attended. So really enjoyed that. Science fair was fine. I don't think there was no sort of amazing new technology solution that I found out about at the science fair, but it's always nice to kind of see what's out there, and certainly certain consultants and vendors. It's always nice to kind of put a face with the name and talk to them a little bit. NTEN hands out 5 or 6 awards every year, so that's always exciting when you get to hear about what people in the community are doing, some of the exciting work that people are doing with technology. So I really enjoyed that. And then before the keynote, they have the Nonprofit Video Awards, and they basically have, I think, 4 different categories, and they pick the best the best video from the past year by a nonprofit organization. That's sponsored by Cisco. And there's actually a website called Daily Do-Gooder, dailydogooder.com, which every day posts a new video by a nonprofit. So some of the videos are, amusing, some are sad, some are advocacy-oriented, some are, just trying to get the word out, and some are fundraising focused. So it's a wide variety of videos, but it was really interesting and something that I enjoyed seeing. Any final takeaways, Matt?
No, I mean, I just sent out the links to the Daily Do-Gooder, and actually the winner, I think of the large organization impact, but the Rainforest Alliance Follow the Frog video, which is hilarious and well worth your time. But yeah, I think that that overall it was a very good conference, and I also wanted to send out the link. I think the one vendor, so to speak, that was, I think, new and interesting, and I think is worth sharing with the community, is an organization called mobilecitizen.org. They provide basically discounted mobile Wi-Fi access for nonprofits. We actually did a webinar with them, I don't know, probably 2 years ago at this point, when they were just localized, I think, in Portland and maybe Denver, but they've expanded nationwide so that if you're a nonprofit organization, you can take advantage of their donated or discounted Wi-Fi to give users with laptops or your kind of mobile data collection access to that. So that was one of the good vendors to take note of.
Great. Well, so in summary, N10 Nonprofit Technology Conference, great learning experience, a lot of fun, well worth it. They're going to be in DC next year. Definitely think about going. They have like 50 scholarships, I think, that they're, am I misspeaking? I think that's about right, that they're awarding this year. So you could go to their website, n10.org, to look into that. Anyways, that's our wrap-up. Did want to note that we're going to have another webinar next month. We really enjoyed these webinar series. It's going to be Matt and I again, another tag team webinar. We're going to talk about IT planning and budgeting, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more focused. The webinar today was a summary, our impressions of the conference. This webinar is going to be more concrete, tangible, some tips that you can use in your IT planning and budgeting process, and we'll allow for a little bit more time for Q&A as well. I also want to give a shout out to Roshni, who you heard at the beginning. She's really instrumental in making these webinars happen. I can safely say that without her, they would not happen at all. So we really enjoyed doing it. I was kind of surprised in Minneapolis at the number of people who came up to me and said, oh, we love the community IT webinars. So we just want to thank Roshni also for her efforts on making this happen. If you're interested in getting the slides for today's webinar, you can just go to our website. They'll be there, as well as a link to the recording. And we encourage you to connect with us through all of the social media outlets that are available. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care.